I am Dr. Donald Donahue, the president of the World Association for Disaster and Emergency Medicine. And today we're talking obviously about abstract development and presentation. Uh, research, research, reports from the field, and information sharing are the essence of what we do in disaster and emergency medicine. The field is changing rapidly, and I can tell you that research and reporting is the highest priority for the World Health Organization, for WADM, and for many, many organizations who deal in humanitarian and disaster response. Today, I have the profound honor to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Michael Franc. Professor Franc is our newly appointed editor-in-chief of our journal, Prehospital Disaster Medicine. And briefly, if I talk to his entire background, he would have no time to give this presentation. Dr. Franc is a research director in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Alberta in Canada. He's a visiting professor in disaster medicine at the Università del Piemonte Orientale in Novara, Italy, and the chief statistician of CRIMIDEN, the Center for Research and Training in Disaster Medicine, Humanitarian Aid, and Global Health, also in Italy, co-located. He's the CEO and founder of Stat59, an artificial intelligence-based statistics software platform. And as editor-in-chief, he joins a very short but phenomenally distinguished predecessors of editors-in-chief. Our journal launched in 1985, and Dr. Franc is only the fifth editor to lead this, our flagship publication. So for no further ado, Dr. Franc.
All right. Thank you very much, Don. And yeah, it's a real pleasure for me to be here to talk to all of you about the essentials of a compelling conference abstract from draft to perfection. Don did a great job of introducing me, so I'll skip that. Conflict disclosure information, as Don mentioned, I have some research funding from the CMA, Canadian Medical Association, and Faculty of Medicine of Dentistry. I'm an employee at the University of Alberta, and I am the CEO and founder of Stat59. What we're going to talk about today is how to create a good research abstract for a conference. But really what we're going to talk about is all good advice for manuscript presentation in general. Okay, so good research reporting is universal. We're focusing here today on conference abstracts, but you'll find a lot of information is valid to all types of research. Our webinar format here, it's going to be largely didactic because I'm in one country and the rest of you are probably somewhere else. I see there's a lot of talk going on in the chat. Thank you. It's really helpful for me as a presenter to have your questions and your comments in the chat. I like to know if something I said is unclear, if people can still hear me, and just pop your questions in the chat and I'm happy to answer them as we go along. We should have a good time for questions and answers at the end of the webinar as well. All right, so what I'm going to share with you is the 10-step plan that I use to to build a conference abstract. Number one, read the instructions for authors. Two, have a clear and interesting objective, inserted as per the abstract guidelines. And we're going to go through each of these in detail. Think about the value proposition, create a snappy title that includes the study design, write a focused introduction that leads the reader to why your objective is important. Summarize the methods to reflect what you did. Add your ethics approval. Summarize the important results using the journal style formatting. Write a discussion and conclusion that answers the study objective. Word count and revision, and then copywriting. Okay, so we're going to go through each of these steps in detail, and I'm going to show you how I do it. Writing a conference abstract is kind of like making a lasagna, right? So there's a bunch of different ways to make a lasagna. This is what ChatGPT says to do to make a lasagna, but all of you might have your own different lasagna recipe. So I'm giving you my recipe for creating a conference abstract. Is it the right way? Is it the perfect way? Is it the best way for you? It's there here for you to try it out. All right. So number one is to read the instructions for authors. When I started to work with Andrew to kind of visualize how this presentation would go, First thing I did was I talked to some of my colleagues and mentors who were journal editors and researchers. And I said, what's your number one piece of advice? And they say, number one, for sure, read the instructions for authors. I'm a computer software programmer as well. And we also call this RTFM, which is read the full manual. Okay, so read the instructions for authors. The most common reason for immediate rejection of an abstract or a manuscript is not paying attention to the formatting. Okay, so that's the first thing that we see when we review an abstract. We see when we review a manuscript is what's the format. Okay, so here is the instructions for authors for the 23rd Congress on Disaster and Emergency Medicine, taking place in Tokyo in the fall. Sorry, not in the fall, in the spring of next year. Deadline, Sunday, 3rd of November. And here's your submission overview process. And this is really super important because missing any of this is going to be the first reason your abstract gets sent back. Okay, so abstracts are submitted in English. Presenting author should be the first named author on the abstract. So that varies from conference to conference. Sometimes you can put that author anywhere, but you need to underline it. 300 words. Abstract should not be written in first person pronouns such as we, our, and I. Okay, so abstracts here follow the PDM format, which is past passive, so we don't use first person. No tables or figures, and they have to have the following section: introduction, methods, results, conclusions. Okay, so every abstract format's a little bit different. That's why it's really important to read those instructions for authors. What I do here when I'm building my own is I right away open up my Word document. I put those 4 subhead or headings in there: introduction, methods, results, conclusions. And then I write a little comment to myself up in the top, 300 words max. So I kind of fit those into my my Word document format right at the beginning so that I don't have to be looking for them. Okay. So that's it. The number one thing, read those instructions for authors. The second thing is to move on to your objective. So have a clear and interesting objective and insert it into the abstract where the guidelines tell you. Okay. So the big question around your abstract is, what are you trying to prove? And that's the objective. Okay, so there should be something behind your research study that you are trying to prove, and you want to get that out in a way that people can associate it with. So sometimes the research abstract will have an objectives heading. If not, it should be the last sentence in your background and introduction. Remember, the objective is the purpose of for the study, okay? The what are you trying to prove? It's not the methodology. It's not what type of study you did. And generally, well, good research in general has a single primary objective. And in your research abstract, for sure, you have 300 words. It's usually best to have a single primary objective. So, here's just some examples. I made all of these up, but, a not so awesome objective would be: the objective of the study was to survey hospital staff following a mass shooting incident. Again, it's like there's no, what are you trying to prove? That's not the objective of your study. That's what you did. As opposed to the primary objective of this study was to determine the incidence of various coping strategies used by hospital providers following a mass shooting incident. So here's the, what am I trying to prove? I'm trying to prove something about the coping strategies. Another not so awesome objective. The objective was to perform a scoping review of the use of N95 masks. Right? So that's a methodology. Doesn't tell me at all what you're trying to prove. As opposed to, the objective of this study was to determine which N95 masks are more comfortable for the wearer. Okay, I'm trying to prove that some masks are more comfortable than others. The main objective was to perform an ethnographic study of the earthquake survivors in Amatrice. Again, that's about a method. It has nothing to do with what you're trying to prove. As opposed to, The main objective was to determine which cultural patterns were helpful during the recovery phase for survivors of the Amatrice earthquake. All right, so these are just some ones that I made up, but you can see really focusing your objective on what am I trying to prove, not on your methodology. Okay. Number 3 is to think about the value proposition. Value proposition is not something we usually talk about in research. This is something that I kind of kidnapped or stole from the startup world. In the startup world, they talk about the value proposition, which is your company, which is the blue part. What is your company providing, your products and services? What gain do they have for what pain do they relieve? And then your customers. What is your customer's job? What are their gains and what are their pains? And it's a useful way to decide, is your startup going to be useful? And now, when I teach research methodology, we talk a lot about this, moving that into the world of research. Your objectives, your product or service, what are you proving? What type of gains come from that, or what type of pain does it relieve? And your audience, what gains or pains are they looking for from your research? So the question is here, does your research, what you're finding, lead to some gain for your audience or some relief of pain for the audience? This is also called the impact. And research projects that don't have an impact, that don't somehow have a gain for the audience, are not very exciting. Okay, just give you an example of how value proposition works. So this was a study that I worked on that I was very excited. I presented as an abstract at USAM in Amsterdam in 2014. And what we had been working on was classification of Twitter data after the 2012 earthquake. So this is a long time ago. It's kind of in the Paleolithic age of social media. And we were looking at tweets that were sent out during the earthquake. And we were classifying them into a 5-step pattern that a taxonomy someone else had invented that said, are they giving information? Are they getting information? Are they requesting help? Okay. So we had 2 medical students going to classify these, and there was 15,000 of them. So the medical students had to go through them one by one and classify them. And I thought this was like kind of a silly use of labor. So I'm like, well, I'm going to build a machine learning algorithm to classify them instead, right? And you can see there's my super exciting graph that shows the cross agreement of tweets, and particularly using string kernel support. Vector machine was incredibly accurate, 81%. It actually matched the level of cross agreement of the 2 raters. So I'm presenting this in Amsterdam and I'm super excited. I look up and that's my audience. Okay. The audience is like, what is the value proposition of what you just told me? Or the who cares? And the reality was that nobody in this group of disaster medicine professionals really cared about my research. And it was a good lesson for me about value proposition. This is a big question. Who cares? Or Jos Behrens is one of my mentors. He always says the so what question. What are you trying to prove? You've proven something, so what? And this is a super important part about your abstract. The number one thing you want to show in your abstract is that you're proving something that people should care about, okay? So people don't care about your research, they care about their problems. And research that doesn't answer to a problem is really, really not interesting for most people, okay? So try to think through that. The value proposition I really like as a way of connecting your audience to your objectives, and are you creating value for them? I go through this exercise of asking myself the so what and who cares before I move on to the next step, which is writing about the title. Because the title, you really want to show a gain for people, okay? So our next step is to create a snappy title that includes the study design, okay? So these are the guidelines actually that come from the Journal of Medical Internet Research, JMIR, which is a Canadian journal. I think does a really good job of guiding readers through what a title should look like. So about 280 characters, descriptive of the subject, do not reveal the results, concise, should be understandable outside the field, and should include the study design. And they actually show some examples for 5 different types of research. So for original papers like systematic reviews or randomized controlled trials, description, study type, research question. Internet health information seeking and the patient-physician relationship, systematic review. Okay. So, formatting your titles, not so awesome title, a survey of hospital staff following a mass shooting incident. I mean, this is just not really something that people are going to get excited about. Coping strategies used by hospital staff following a mass shooting incident. Okay, so that is a good title. You'll notice that I kept out survey from that title. I generally, if the study design is weak, like it's a survey, then I tend to not put the type in there. Okay, so I would leave it out. Not so awesome title. The Zenith 421 mask is more comfortable than other N95 masks. This is that, give your answer in the title. I don't want the answer in the title. I want the title to compel people or encourage people to read the rest of the story. So, comparison of provider comfort between commercial N95 masks, a scoping review. Scoping review is a strong study design, so I'm going to put it in there. And which cultural patterns are most helpful to earthquake victims? I mean, that could come from anywhere, right? You could be like, okay, well, that's just my idea. It's like a blog post. It's a scoping review. You don't know anything about it. As opposed to cultural coping patterns among survivors of the 2016 Amatrice earthquake, an ethnographic study. Okay, so these study design or your objectives, description, colon, the type of study, I think is the best way to format those titles. Some people like these fun titles. One of these from one of my mentors, I can't even spell it, Orthomegadon, a retrospective cohort study of weather-dependent variations in emergency department volume in a Canadian city. Or another one, a systematic review examining the impact of redirecting low acuity patients seeking emergency department care. Is the juice worth the squeeze? So these can be kind of fun. Clarity beats cleverness. Okay, so I think they work as long as the analogy actually makes sense. Is the juice worth the squeeze? I think that kind of makes sense, right? So you're squeezing on the low acuity patients. Are you getting anything out of it? So clarity beats cleverness. I tend to avoid them just because I usually don't have a way of getting the clarity across. But if you do, make sure that it's clear why you use that sort of analogy. All right, so that takes us about halfway through. So now we've got our title and we're going to be working on the introduction. This is often the hardest thing for people to write. You're often almost kind of staring at this blank piece of paper and you're like, I have no idea what to put in my introduction. Remember that the introduction is really only there to highlight the importance and relevance of your objective. Okay, it's an introduction moving you to the objective. So I really like this format. I stole this from Ian Steele, who wrote an excellent paper on how to write a manuscript. And he talks about the introduction in these 3 pieces. The first one is the definition, the epidemiology, and the importance of what you're talking about. Then you move to a knowledge gap. Okay, so you want to say, we know this about the situation, but what is missing is this piece. And the objectives of the study is how that gap will be addressed. Okay, so some definition about it, knowledge gap, how will you address that? Don't fail to account for the audience's level of knowledge. So, it really helps to know that if you are creating an abstract for the WADM conference in Tokyo, these are most likely disaster medicine and pre-hospital specialists, right? So know that's who they are. They're probably not specialists in chemical contamination, but they're also not people off the street, okay? Don't provide an extensive review and don't emphasize other people's findings in the introduction. I find a lot of people like to quote a lot of other people's studies in the introduction. Really don't need that much. We just need to know which direction it's going to the importance of your objective. So, I see a lot of this kind of introduction that starts, a disaster is defined as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this is like not really necessary for a conference abstract that's going to be read by disaster medicine and pre-hospital providers. We don't want to know the definition of a disaster. We don't need the definition of surge capacity. An awesome introduction often provides some information that you might not know, like worldwide in 2022, measles cases rose by 18%, and deaths due to measles rose 43% when compared to 2021. So there's your epidemiology and importance, then your knowledge gap. However, little is known about the patient's perception of the reason for this increase. And then you move into your objective. The primary objective of this study was to measure patients' perception of the reasons for the measles increase. So you see how I use that epidemiology importance leads into a knowledge gap and then right into my objective. Okay, so once you've got your objective introduction, then we're going to talk about the methods. So we're going to summarize the methods to reflect what we did and add the ethics approval if you can fit it in. Okay, so this is all the fun stuff that should go into the methods of like a manuscript. Okay, if I was writing a manuscript, I need the study design, the study setting, who the participants are, including the ethics approval. What are the interventions? What are the outcome measures? How did I get the data? How did I analyze the data? How did I choose the sample size? And then often the research question or the null and alternative hypotheses. You're not going to have room usually in your conference abstract to put all that. So we're really looking at highlighting the unique pieces of your own study. Here's a question that comes up all the time. Do I need ethics approval? This is a field in constant movement. It's going in one direction, which is more and more responsibility on the researcher for proving their ethical administration of the study. Okay, so 10 years ago, we did a lot of studies that were like chart reviews or data reviews where we didn't need ethics approval, but now ethics approval is needed for all human subject studies, okay? Including an intervention. I gave someone a medication, a survey. I had people complete an online survey. I phoned them and asked them questions on the telephone. I sent them emails and asked them to respond. Pre and post tests, okay, you have an educational intervention and you are having the people write a test afterwards, human ethics approval. Any access to health records, even if you have them for some other reason. So this is a common misconception that comes up, is that people say, oh, I'm working in, I'm going to give this as an example because this is a student that I work with and I know she has agreed to let me talk about this, but she was a nurse working for the Canadian Armed Forces. She had all the information about the patients who were getting blood transfusions. She was a clinical nurse. She was responsible for quality improvement for the blood transfusion program. She had all the information about them on her laptop. She wanted to review them to create a research project. So no new access to data. She has the data. The military absolutely said, no, there's no way. You cannot access that data for research purposes, even though you must see it to do the rest of your job. Okay, so health records, educational records, those are all, if you're using them for research purposes, you need an ethics approval. Okay, email interviews and observing human activities as well. Okay, just so you go watch people, that's an ethics approval. One of the misconceptions that for sure I had when I was starting this out is what studies are exempt. And I said things like, well, the study's exempt because we didn't access any private records. Okay, so you can't exempt your own study. Only your Health Research Ethics Board can give it an exempt status. So if your study is exempt, you need a note from that board, and you need to say in your abstract, the study was deemed exempt from formal ethics approval by the Health Research Ethics Board at the University of Alberta. Okay, so if it has a human subject, it has data about humans, if you're accessing, talking to anyone, observing anyone, emailing anyone, it absolutely needs ethics approval. And we cannot publish studies that do not have ethics approval. And I do know that part of the abstract application for the Wadham conference is the ethics approval, right? So you need it. If you don't have it, you need to get it. When you're writing your methods, one of the things that you don't want to do is have the results creep into the methods, okay? So, sometimes people will put like demographics in the methods or sample size. So, I read the methods and it says, in this survey study, 247 people were surveyed, of which 51% were female, 49% were male. That's data about your study. That is not in the methods. Okay, that's results. So really just watch for those. I'm going to use an example here of an abstract that one of my colleagues wrote, Dr. Brian Rowe. He's a mentor of mine and has published somewhere between 500 and 1,000 peer-reviewed articles. And this is an example of an abstract that flows very nice. So I'm going to read through it because it is very interesting. So abstract here, this one has a background. The purpose of the study was to determine the inter-rater agreement between reviewers on the quality of abstract submissions to an annual national scientific meeting. Okay, so here we go. We know right from the abstract, the background is the objective of the study, purpose of the study. Methods. All abstracts were submitted using an online system and assessed by 3 volunteer reviewers, blinded to the abstract score. Reviewers used an online form specific for each type of study design to score the abstract based on 9 criteria, each contributing from 2 to 6 points towards the total for a maximum of 24. The final score was determined to be the mean of the 3 reviewers' score using interclass correlation coefficients. All right, so you see the objective of the study was to determine the inter-rater agreements, and the methods tell you exactly what method was used to find the inter-rater agreement. Okay, so the methods are, how did you prove the objective that you set out to prove? Okay, and you can see it's quite simple there to look through those and see what those look like. All right. Finally, we're moving on to the result. Oh yeah, we're going to get to that. Chanel, thanks for asking that question. It's very interesting. We're actually going to show the results of his study. I thought it was actually kind of fun because we're talking about abstracts here, and this study was about abstracts, and I will show you the results. All right, so for summarizing the results, we're going to summarize the important results, and big thing here is to use the journal's style formatting, okay? So for effective results, you want to summarize the important findings, ensure that you address all the outcomes mentioned in the methods, okay? So that's the number one thing that I want to see in the results. You said you were going to prove inter-rater agreement. I better see that in the results. Usually, the best way to frame those results is to start with the descriptive results. Okay, so if I'm doing, we talked about the coping strategies, my idea for what are the coping strategies after mass shooting incidents. That's one of my examples for the title. So first will be the descriptive results. We received survey results from 495 people, of which 300 had been exposed to a mass shooting incident. Then after your descriptive results is your hypothesis testing or your objectives. So in this case, it would be coping strategies differed between males and females, or differed between rural and urban areas. And then last thing in your results would be your exploratory data analysis. So these tend to be things that you found out by accident. And these are super valuable, and we shouldn't undermine them or underestimate them. But if you found it out by accident, it should be presented as that. And usually that's the last thing. We also found that people with red hair tended to use religious coping strategies more, right? Wasn't what we were looking for, but we found it out. Okay, so results usually get put in that order. Use the abstract or the journal's format. So we looked at the instructions for authors for the Wadham conference, but it didn't give a lot of detail on how to present the results. So these I got from the PDM, Prehospital and Disaster Medicine instructions for authors. For instance, never start a sentence with a digit. That's something as an English language speaker drives me crazy. PDM reports means as the mean and the 95% confidence interval. Okay, so we don't report them with a standard error or standard deviation. We want to see mean plus 95% confidence interval. Report the medians with an IQR. Identify the statistical test used for each outcome and present numbers and percentages in the text. All right. All right, so here is, again, Brian Rowe's abstract about the interclass coefficient. So here we start. 495 abstracts were received electronically, increasing from 94 in 2001 to 165 in 2004. Okay, mean score in the abstract over 4 years was 14.4. Right, so that's your just descriptive results. Then we're going to go into our hypothesis test. While there was no significant difference between mean total scores over the 4 years, the ICC increased from fair, 0.36, with a 95% confidence interval of 0.24 to 0.49, to moderate, 0.59, 95% confidence interval, 0.5 to 0.68. And then reviewers agreed less on individual criteria than on the total score in general, and less on subjective than objective criteria. So this is sort of your exploratory data analysis. This is probably something that they weren't looking for, right? They didn't mention it in the objectives, but it's something that they found that's interesting. You'll notice that they did not provide a p-value or a confidence interval for that. Exploratory data analysis, things you found. There was a relationship between red hair and coping strategy. We can mention them, but we shouldn't put confidence intervals. Thank you to Ijaz for noting that, yes, Dr. Rowe started a sentence with a digit, which I really don't like. Okay. All right, gonna move along here. Now we're moving on to number 8. Shambel, thank you for your question. I'm going to address that a little bit later during our Q&A period, because this is a very good question. Next is to write the discussion or the conclusion. This is probably, I would say, in general, I find the one that researchers struggle with the most in writing a manuscript or in an abstract. The discussion, or especially the conclusion. So we're going to write a discussion and conclusion. What is the conclusion? The conclusion is the answer to your study objective. Okay. So if you're stuck on the discussion, right? So you're writing a paper. I love this formula. Again, it comes from Even Steele. Write a paragraph of interpreting what the main findings mean. Write a paragraph that includes previous studies and compare your results to previous studies. Write a paragraph about the strengths and limitations, and then write a paragraph about the clinical implications or the operational implications, and then write a paragraph about future research implications. Okay, I like to tie those all together. The most important thing about your conclusion is that is the findings of your study. Okay, conclusions. What is the conclusion from your study? presents the answer to the research objectives. Don't suggest associations or causation that you have not yet proven. So what I'll see is people come up with, Brian Rowe's paper that showed that there was an increase in the correlation from the first year to the second. And in the conclusion, they say, in our study, we found an increase in interclass correlation between the first year and the second, which we believe may be due to better education. It's like, well, that came out of nowhere. If your study wasn't looking at the relationship between education and the interclass correlation, shouldn't be in the conclusions. Don't stretch beyond the reach of your study, okay? So you notice that we're not going to talk about all conference abstracts. We'll say all abstracts have low correlation, therefore we need better education, which will fix the problem. That doesn't work that way. It's really nice if you can echo your value proposition in the conclusion and explicitly explain how your study can improve, right? So the results of our survey on coping strategies could lead to better understanding and planning for coping strategy teaching, okay? So how it can improve our understanding. And never say this, more research is needed. This is like, does not belong in the conclusions. I use this analogy. You're trying to sell your abstract to someone. You're trying to sell your manuscript and explain to them why it's valuable. I take my car to get to the car wash, okay? I take it to this car wash where they do it all for you, and then it comes out. And what I can tell you, the person who comes, delivers my car, opens the car door and says, okay, we washed the steering wheel, we vacuumed your rugs, we put the door jambs. The last thing I want him to say is, clearly further car cleaning is needed. It's like, I don't want to know about further car cleaning. I want to know why I just paid you to clean my car. Okay, so when you end your research study with further research is needed, it's absolutely the wrong direction. I don't want to pay for that car wash and I'm not coming back. Okay. All right, so how did Dr. Rowe in his part about reviewer agreement trends write his conclusion? Okay. The correlation between reviewers' total scores suggests general recognition of high and low quality abstract. Criteria based on the presence absence of objective methodological parameters resulted in higher inter-rate agreement than the more subjective and opinion-based criteria. In future abstract competitions, defining criteria may more objectively so that reviewers can base their responses on empirical evidence may lead to increased consistency of scoring and presumably increased fairness to submitters, okay? So he has created a value proposition now, right? So to me, I'm planning a conference and I'm like, oh, maybe in our abstract competition, we will need to be more objective so our reviewers can get better interclass correlation. Okay, so it echoes what their conclusion and how it might be used. Notice he did not say that no research is needed. In fact, in my survey of the people I knew that were editors and my mentors for how to do an abstract, the number one was read the instructions for authors. Number two was never conclude more research is necessary. Next, we check the word count and revise as needed. All right, so make sure you use that Microsoft word count. I personally love it when I'm just over. Just over is the best kind of stuck because then it's just a little bit of grammatical jujitsu to get it to fit into the abstract. If you're way under, it's often much harder because you're like, I don't have anything else to say. Check that word count and revise it. And then get help with the copywriting, okay? Copywriting is super hard, okay? By copywriting, I mean the actual grammar and spelling, okay? So English language journals expect university level English language, okay? So I'm actually giving this webinar right now from my office in Italy. Italian is my second language. I teach in Italian. I certainly can order dinner. I get by. Everyone understands what I say. I understand what everybody says. But there's absolutely no way I could write in the level at Italian university level, like a first language Italian speaker would work. So when I was working on my website and we needed to translate pages from Italian, I absolutely had first language Italian speaker look that over. Okay, so ask for help, look it up. The Chicago Manual of Style, if any of you ever picked this up, this book is about probably 500-600 pages. It basically tells people who are English language speakers how to speak English. It's super hard. Okay, so many of us struggle, particularly if you're second language, and need to ask for help. It is absolutely not a sign of weakness. How do you get help? Well, these are the copywriting tools that are, some examples. Microsoft Word has amazing spelling and not so bad grammar. Grammarly, a lot of people use. I use this language tool. So I use a grammar checker for mine as well. It's amazing how much stuff it picks up. There's all the AI-based things. ChatGPT does pretty good grammar. And then the number one, I read this on a Reddit once, and so I can't really take credit to it, but it said, what's the best way to spot the errors in your research abstract? And it said, turn it into a PDF. I'm sure all of you have seen that. As soon as you turn your document into a PDF, it needs a bunch of changes and you have to make a new PDF. And then, like, I literally asked my mother. My mother is an accountant. She's not in the medical field, but she reads all my abstracts and my manuscripts. She's an accountant. She's relatively well educated and she has a very good knowledge of grammar. If she can't understand what I'm saying, then I need to rephrase it. So it also helps to have someone who is not from your specialty field read it, because they should still be able to understand it. My mother won't understand all the details of the statistical test I used, but she should be able to understand the basics of what I'm saying. So get those copywriting tools. So that's kind of the summary of what the 10-step plan works. So read the instructions for authors. Again, go through them one by one. I build my Word template right then and there. I put the details in comments. Have a clear and interesting objective, right? The objective is, what are you trying to prove? And find out where it belongs in the abstract guidelines. Think about the value proposition. What's the impact? The so what question. Don't write a question about machine learning. Don't write as abstract about machine learning of tweets and present it at a disaster medicine conference. Get a snappy title, include the study design, especially if it's a strong design like a scoping review, qualitative study, randomized controlled trial. Write a focused introduction that leads the reader to why your objective is important. And often that starts with some epidemiology. It leads into a knowledge gap, and then from there to your objective. Summarize the methods to reflect what you did. And if you have, not everyone puts the ethics approval in the abstract. If you're writing a manuscript, it has to be there. I add it if space permitting. You need to have it, but whether you write it in your abstract or not is usually space pending. Summarize the important results. Use the journal style formatting. The journal asks for confidence intervals. Don't use the plus or minus standard deviation. Write a discussion or conclusion that answers your study objective. Conclusions about your study, not conclusions about other people's study, not conclusions about philosophy. Check the word count, revise, and get help with the copywriting. Use those electronic tools. And if you can, ask your mom. All right. So we have a couple questions that came up in the chat. So I'm going to start through those, and anyone who's out there who has questions, just pop them on there. Thanks for an insightful presentation. My questions has to do with the ethical clearance. How about the data that was collected for the purpose of outbreak investigation and response needed to publish with the aim of sharing information with the global community? Do we still need ethical approval that might delay evidence dissemination? Yes, the answer is yes. You absolutely need ethical approval. The question is going to be who it comes from and how much they need, how much they're going to intervene. Okay. So many of if this is that was data that was taken for an outbreak investigation, it's completely de-identified, then most likely your ethics board is going to say either it's exempt, they're going to say you don't need it, or this is what they would call implied consent. So the patients don't need to give consent. They're probably not going to ask you to go back and get consent. But absolutely, someone is going to need to get ethical approval. And where that's going to come from is going to depend. If you're working for the WHO, then you're going to ask the WHO about ethics approval. If you work for the Canadian military, you have to ask the Canadian military for approval. But you absolutely need ethics approval. Unfortunately, delayed to dissemination. We thought the study was important. We needed to get the information out. Will not be considered adequate reason to not get ethics. That's up to the ethics boards to approve. Okay, so I hope that answers your question, Shambell. From Deb Weiner, thanks for the terrific webinar. Can you share your guidance regarding limitations, what to include and not to include? Yeah. That is a very good question. So it's really tough to write these limitations. The thing about that I always focus on is what are the obvious limitations about the study design, particularly if these are just, most of these tend to be inherent in research and disaster medicine, right? So, it's like, unfortunately, although this study showed a difference in health pre and post earthquake, it is not a randomized study, right? So that's a very realistic limitation. If there was any, protocol violations or missing data, you kind of have to point those out. But yeah, you don't want to go too far. I tend to kind of emphasize what we do know and sort of compromise in scope rather than quality, right? So rather than saying, the information was terrible, I'm more likely to say the information is valid under this specific scope, hasn't been tried under another scope. It's really tough though, Deb. I don't have any really good advice. It tends to be a bit of an art. It pays to be honest though, because if you try to hide it, someone's going to find it anyways. And it's actually quite embarrassing to have someone pull it up while you're giving your presentation. Will Wadham accept research abstracts based on exploratory study designs? My research involved risk to field hospital, earthquakes, disaster zone, and my risk analysis used an exploratory design. Yeah, so the PDM does accept these more exploratory research abstracts and research manuscripts. So PDM has two types of research. There's original research and there's research reports. Original research is where we tend to expect like super high quality research, big enough sample size, but the research reports are really there to showcase these preliminary studies, pilot studies. So I would definitely say yes. Chanel, we would be interested in looking at those for sure. And I would encourage you to apply to the section on research reports. Dr. Mick Malloy, do limitations need to be in the abstract, bearing in mind that the word count is limited? So can't these part of the discussion or poster if accepted? Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very reasonable. You do have to be quite selective about your abstracts. I personally look at them. What I really want is people to be interested in what I'm doing. The abstract is never enough to really get all the pros and cons of my research. So yeah, I think that's very reasonable. Thank you for the excellent webinar. I have one question. In conference abstracts, the word limit is not allowed to discuss results in detail. Is it reasonable to merge results with discussion? I would say no. I would say that you want to somehow divide those out. Okay, so make sure that the results are separate for discussion. One of the things, sort of the key point in that is that results should never present a new fact, or sorry, discussion should never present a new fact that wasn't presented in the results. Okay, so if there's a number, you're going to use you're going to say the average number of days person had a diarrheal illness following the epidemic was 7. That has to be presented in the results and not presented in the discussion. It's just a little bit, again, it's a little bit usually of some jujitsu of moving those sentences around. But the big guideline, Mohammed, is no new numbers, no new results in the discussion. All right, we just have a couple minutes left. We did have a couple questions that came up through the forum beforehand. Question 1, given the international nature of the conference, what are the key priorities for the group and what is needed but under-addressed? All right. This is actually super important for conference abstracts and for funding applications as well. So these are the abstract submission categories for the WADM conference. So this is where you want to try to fit your abstract. Those are the key priorities for the group. Okay, so humanitarian population, health, hazards and exposures, educational training and research. If you're doing an abstract and it doesn't fit in any of these categories, for instance, you will see that machine learning algorithms to classify tweets, it does not fit on any of these, then you're probably presenting at the wrong conference, which is what I was doing. Okay, so, all right. Question 2, what's the difference between a conference abstract and a journal abstract? These are fun. I don't know if any of you generate your images using DALL-E or OpenAI or ChatGPT, but for reasons I can't quite understand, they never get the text quite right. So this is conference abstract and journal abstract. Really not much of a difference. The only difference I would say is that in a conference abstract, you're really trying to get people to find out more by either viewing your poster or going to your session, where in a journal abstract, they're about to read something right afterwards. So it does, it's sort of a different focus, but generally I find writing them to be basically the same. This is super interesting because, one of these other questions. Almost all international conferences are in English language. Non-English native speakers might be at a disadvantage. Any advice or recommendations? We talked about this a little bit. I know when I've taught in Italian, one of my good friends, when I was just starting my sabbatical here in Italy, and I was like really struggling with my Italian, he took me to Sicily and said, oh, by the way, you're teaching like a 1-day course to medical students on disaster management. I definitely felt at a disadvantage. And your second language, you're definitely at a disadvantage. What are my advice and recommendations? Leverage those tools. Your Microsoft Word, your ChatGPT, Grammarly, language tool, Chicago Manual Style, and your mom. All right, so just leverage those tools. The introduction of these tools has definitely leveled the playing field quite a bit. Okay, so I definitely feel that the ability to use these tools does level the playing field. And to the extent that the really simple grammar errors and spelling errors, they're really kind of not excusable anymore. All right, so like Grammarly, you can use that online and it will pick those up. So, if I see a conference abstract or a manuscript where it's clear that nobody took the time to go through the spelling on Microsoft Word or to use Grammarly to check the grammar, I think we find inexcusable. Most of us are pretty good. I can tell you that if you look at many journals, they will say that we don't refuse manuscripts based entirely on language. Okay, so if you are clearly English is not your first language, the manuscript is amazing. It has a good impact. It has good values proposition. We're not going to refuse it just with English language. And for instance, if you're publishing with PDM, we have an amazing managing editor that will help with that during the editorial process. And then finally, this is interesting because I put this one in myself because no one had asked it, but actually I see that a couple people asked insight on the concerns about AI tools. All right. So this is, can we use AI to help us write a conference abstract? Okay. So this is super interesting. This is evolving on a daily basis. Okay. So what I'm telling you today may not be valid tomorrow. This is my approach. First, check the journal's guidelines on AI use. A year and a half ago, they were all over the place. Now they're mostly converging on two basic facts. AI can never be a co-author. Some of the initial papers with ChatGPT actually listed ChatGPT as a co-author. Co-authors must be responsible for the content of what is written. And since AI cannot be responsible, cannot be a co-author. Most journals allow quite judicious use of AI, but most journals you have to declare it. So either in the methods, if it's central to the methodology of the paper, in the acknowledgements, if it is helped with the writing, or and often and in the cover letter. So I always write these. If I use AI for something, I write in the cover letter. ChatGPT was used to restructure and reformat. Okay. Some of them want explicit details. Like if you do diagrams, like images, figures, some of the journals will want to see the exact prompt you use. Okay. Things to remember, though, is you are responsible for what goes on. So you're responsible for all content, whatever it says. Okay. So if you get ChatGPT you ask it a question and it gives an answer, you're responsible for that answer. And remember that ChatGPT and large language models like Llama and the other ones, they do confabulate or hallucinate, as they say. These models don't know what's true and what's not. They just give their best answer. Often they're right, but they will make up things. I do a demonstration where I can get ChatGPT to really effectively explain why aliens are the best at doing triage. Okay, so you're responsible for all content. Make sure you don't violate any copyright when you build the prompt. Okay, so in the OpenAI agreement is you have copyright or permission to use the material you put in the prompt. So going to an example that is not allowed is to go to the literature, find someone who wrote an awesome systematic review. Brian Rowe, one of my mentors, he's like written a couple hundred of these. So go there, cut the methodology from Brian Rowe's paper, paste it into OpenAI and say to OpenAI, this is the methodology for a systematic review, reword it and cut it down to 500 words. That is absolutely in violation because I do not have permission to cut and paste Brian Rowe's material. Okay. Ensure the final product does not violate any copyright. So where does ChatGPT get its text? Okay, so the GPT stands for Generalized Pre-trained Transformer. The pre-trained means that it's trained on other people's text. So it's not impossible that ChatGPT regurgitates a bunch of text that someone else wrote. And if that happens, you are the violator of the copyright. Okay, OpenAI is not the violator of the copyright, you are. And we will catch that in the journal. The journals check plagiarism through something called Authenticate or Crossref, and you're responsible for that. And then finally, with these OpenAI and other the large language models. They do occasionally make up references. Okay, so be careful for that. You can get lots of references about alien triaging if you ask for it. So make sure the references exist and are correct. And so you need to check those one by one. All right. That brings us to the end of our scheduled time. Okay, so our 1 hour session. I am happy to stick around if there's anyone who wants to ask some further questions. I'm available to stick around. For the rest of you who have other appointments, thank you very much for joining us here today. We will look forward to seeing you in Tokyo, and I look forward to seeing your abstracts. And Andrew, you're still on the line with us? Andrew? Yeah.
Yep, I'm still here.
Andrew, if it's okay with you, we're also going to work on a little evaluation form to send out to all the participants to let us know what they thought of the session.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Because we, as Dr. Donahue said, I just took over as editor for PDM on July 1st, and I am happy to go on providing these webinars to help with these processes if people find them helpful. So we'll be looking forward to your feedback. Thank you, everyone.
I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. A lot of thank yous. Well, thank you, Jeff. That was great. Appreciate your time. I know you're busy. You're in Italy. And so thanks for taking time out of the day there to do this webinar for us. I think it was really, really helpful. And I look forward to the other proposed webinars in the series if we go ahead with those, which I think would be a great idea on how to do a poster, how to do a presentation. So,
all right. Thank you, Andrew, for all the work you did in setting this up, the social media, the webinar invites. I know you put a lot of time into this, so thank you so much. And thank you to everyone. Have a good day.
bye-bye.